Ryker spent 5 years telling Skylar that a woman with no roots was a woman the world would never search for, until the night she sat down beside a man who looked at her like she was the only unfinished thing in a city he had already conquered. The late-night subway rattled through the dark, and Skylar pressed herself into the far corner of the carriage, hot pink sweater bright and wrong against the gray fluorescent quiet, both arms wrapped around her red leather handbag like it was the last solid thing in a world that had come completely undone. Her voluminous natural hair was damp and wild. The window gave her back a stranger, dark bruising masked under her left eye, a faint smear of blood on her cheek, large expressive eyes too wide and too still, locked in the vigilance of a woman whose body had forgotten how to stop waiting. She was running on adrenaline and a hope too fragile to name. Ryker's voice looped quietly in the back of her skull. A woman with no roots is a woman no one searches for. Then the air in the carriage changed. Cedar. Something colder underneath. Metal, clean and precise. Skylar's grip on the handbag tightened before her mind caught up. She looked left and found him. Navy suit. Jet black hair, slicked back from a face built on sharp angles. A dragon tattoo coiling up the full length of his throat. His right fist rested beneath his chin, the back of his hand covered in intricate dark ink. His cold gaze fixed forward with the calm of a man who had already decided every outcome in the room. He was not looking at her with pity. He was not looking away. Skylar understood then that she was caught between two kinds of danger. The one behind her and the one sitting quietly beside her. She was about to find out which one was worse. The train screamed to a halt. Skylar's eyes snapped to the window, and her blood went cold. There, under the aggressive white glare of the platform lights, was Ryker. He wasn't breathless. He wasn't searching. He was waiting. One shoulder leaned against a pillar, jaw rolling slowly, eyes moving straight to her through the glass with the unhurried ease of a man collecting something that belonged to him. He hadn't tracked her. He had predicted her, which was so much worse. Her legs turned to concrete. Her lungs forgot their purpose. 5 years of conditioning fired all at once. Stay small. Don't run. You have nowhere to go. And for one terrible second, the woman in the hot pink sweater believed every word of it. Then the seat beside her was empty. She hadn't heard Gwang stand. There was no scrape of movement, no shift of weight. He simply was beside her, and then he wasn't. He stepped off the train and onto the platform with the unhurried ease of a man who had already decided how this would end. One hand loose at his side, the dragon tattoo crawling up his exposed neck like a living thing in the harsh platform light. He placed himself between Skylar and Ryker and said nothing. The silence on the platform was absolute, swallowing the hiss of the train doors, the distant rumble of the tunnels, everything. Ryker's jaw stopped rolling. His eyes traveled up Gwang's frame and landed on his face, and whatever he found there made something flicker behind his expression. Not recognition, something more animal than that. The instinct that fires in the body before the mind has finished its calculation. Ryker took one step back, then another. Then he turned and was gone, swallowed by the dark at the far end of the platform, his footsteps disappearing into the noise of the city like he had never been there at all. Skylar stood at the train doors, shaking. A hand, not grabbing, not commanding, simply present, appeared at the edge of her vision. Gwang did not look at her with reassurance or warmth. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, directly, without performance, already moving forward. She followed. She wasn't entirely sure she had chosen to. A black car materialized at the platform exit as though it had been there all along. The door opened. Skylar folded herself into the back seat, her red handbag still pressed against her chest, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a vault sealing shut. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched the platform lights shrink and disappear. Ryker was gone. The train was gone. The life she had been running from was somewhere back in the dark behind her. She stared at the city rushing past and asked herself, very quietly, what exactly she had just traded it for. The car didn't take her somewhere safe. Skylar understood that the moment it stopped. The building rose out of the storm like it had been there before the city was built around it. A soaring glass monolith that caught the rain and threw it back as light, cold, and indifferent and enormous. No sainik, no worms, just scale. The kind of structure that didn't need to announce itself because everything around it already knew. The door opened. She got out because there was nothing else to do. Inside, the lobby swallowed sound. Men in dark suits moved through the space with the quiet, calibrated efficiency of people who had long ago replaced instinct with discipline. Eyes tracking, positions shifting, not a wasted gesture among them. Nobody looked at Skylar with curiosity. Nobody looked at her at all. She was simply a variable that had been accounted for, slotted into the evening's calculations without disrupting them. The elevator opened at the summit without a sound. The penthouse was vast and surgically clean. Charcoal furniture, polished concrete floors that reflected the city lights bleeding in through floor-to-ceiling windows. No softness anywhere. No throw blankets. No photographs. Nothing that suggested the space was lived in rather than operated from. Screens glowed on one wall above a low obsidian desk. Two men stood in the hallway beyond, still as furniture, watching nothing and everything simultaneously. Guang shed his suit jacket and handed it to someone who materialized and disappeared in the same breath. He moved to a raw stone bar at the far end of the room, poured 2 glasses of something amber, and crossed to where Skylar stood frozen in the center of the floor, her wet sneakers leaving faint prints on the concrete. He held out a glass. No ceremony. No es mal. She took it with both hands to hide the shaking. You are my home, he said. His voice was low and even, each word placed with the precision of someone who had never needed volume to be heard. My world. My rules. What happens inside these walls happens because I decide it does. He held her gaze without blinking. I won't apologize for what I am, but I will tell you this. Everything here was built to keep the wrong people out. He didn't wait for her response. He simply turned, moving toward the windows, and the city spread out below him like something he owned. Skylar looked down at the glass in her trembling hands, then at his right hand, the one wrapped entirely in dark, intricate ink, a circular motif pressed into the skin like a seal. A map of a life built entirely on his own terms, written permanently into his body so no one could take it from him. She hadn't escaped danger. She understood that now with complete clarity. She had simply exchanged a cage with thin walls for a fortress with iron ones. The guest suite was the quietest place Skylar had ever been. High ceilings, a bed dressed in charcoal linen so precisely made it look untouched by human hands. A tray on the dresser, holding medical supplies and folded fabric she didn't examine yet. The climate control hummed at a frequency just below hearing, and beyond the floor-to-ceiling window, the storm pressed silently against the glass like something that wanted in. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment, not moving. Then she made herself walk to the bathroom. The marble was white and vast, and lit with the kind of light that hid nothing. Skylar stopped in front of the mirror and looked. She had been avoiding this. On the train, in the car, in the elevator, she had kept her eyes moving, kept them anywhere but inward. Now there was nowhere left to look. The face in the mirror was a document of the last 5 years. Dark purple, bruising mass under her left eye, reddish black at its center, the swelling pulling her features into something hollow and unfamiliar. A trail of dried blood on her cheek she hadn't caught in her rush to flee. Thin and dark, almost casual, like an afterthought. Her voluminous hair was still damp, pushed back from her face by the evening's chaos, and her large eyes stared back at her from inside all that damage with an expression she recognized from the very beginning of Ryker. The look of a woman who has stopped expecting anyone to come. Nobody is coming for you. His voice arrived in the silence, so cleanly it could have been in the room. And for one terrible second, one honest, unguarded second, the bruised woman in the mirror believed it completely. Then something else moved. Underneath the exhaustion, underneath the fear, underneath 5 years of being methodically reduced, something shifted, small and quiet and stubborn. Not courage, not anger, just survival, still burning at some low frequency he had never quite managed to extinguish, no matter how many times he tried. She held on to that, and she got to work. She cleaned her wounds with the supplies from the tray, her hands moving with a focus that surprised her, methodical, steady, one thing at a time. She peeled off the hot pink sweater, the jeans, let them fall to the tile without looking at them again. She stepped into the shower and stood under the heat until the water ran clear and the memory of his hands felt further away than it had all night. She dressed in the clean fabric left for her, walked back into the suite, sat on the edge of the bed. In the dark mirror of the window across the room, a woman looked back at her, shoulders still curved, face still marked, but here. Undeniably, stubbornly here. The question that settled in the silence was the first one that had ever belonged entirely to Skylar. What now? Morning arrived, gray and quiet, pressing thin light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like it was asking permission to enter. Skylar found him by sound first, or rather by the absence of it. A rhythm without noise. She followed the hallway until it opened into a glass-walled gym suspended above the city, and stopped at the threshold. Gwang moved against a heavy bag with slow, deliberate strikes. Each one placed, each one intentional. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. It looked nothing like Ryker's violence, which had always been about emotion, about making a point, about the satisfaction of impact. This was different. This was a man who had converted every dangerous thing inside himself into pure controlled precision. He wasn't releasing anything. He was refining it. He stopped without turning around. "You hunch," he said. His voice carried across the quiet room without effort. "You've been doing it so long you don't feel it anymore." Skylar opened her mouth and closed it. She hadn't made a sound at the threshold. He turned then, unhurried, and looked at her with that same level, unreadable gaze, taking in her posture the way someone reads a page, quickly and completely. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her. Without asking, he placed 2 fingers between her shoulder blades and applied the lightest pressure. "Pull them back." She did. It felt wrong immediately. Exposed, too much space taken up, too visible. "It feels like a target," she said. "It feels like that because he taught you that being seen was dangerous." He stepped back and studied her. "Hold it anyway." He kept her there for what felt like a long time, just standing, shoulders back, chin level. Then he made her hold eye contact with him. Not aggressive, not searching, just steady, until the alarm bells Ryker had wired into that particular act began, slowly, to quiet. "Your eyes give everything away," Gwang said. "Not because you're weak, because you were trained to show your fear so he could measure it." He held her gaze. "Look through me, not at me." Give him nothing to measure. She tried. It took longer than she wanted. When it came, that slight shift in focus, that subtle withdrawal behind the eyes, she felt Gwang register it with the smallest nod. "Your isolation," he said, "is not evidence of your failure. It means you have been carrying yourself alone for years." A pause, clean and deliberate. "That is not a wound. That is a skill you haven't learned to use yet." Skylar said nothing. She didn't trust her voice. But something in her chest moved. Not healed, not repaired, nothing so complete as that. Just shifted, like a door she had forgotten existed, turning very slowly on a hinge that still worked. The afternoon settled over the penthouse like something exhaled. No meetings, no screens alive with movement. The city below existed at a remove, muffled by glass and altitude, and Gwang sat at the far end of the room with a cigarette burning low between his fingers, looking out at the gray skyline with the particular stillness of a man who knew how to inhabit silence without needing to fill it. Ryker had never been able to do that. Every quiet moment in that apartment had been loaded, a held breath before accusation, a gap he would eventually fill with something designed to land. Silence, with Ryker, had always been a weapon in the process of being loaded. This was different. This silence simply was. Skylar sat across the room, her hands around a glass of water she hadn't drunk, and turned the question over one more time before she finally let it out. "Why?" she said. "Not the platform. Not the car. All of it. Why any of this?" She paused. Why me? Guang didn't answer immediately. He looked at the cigarette, then at the city, and the stillness around him deepened rather than broke. She had the sense she was watching a man decide something. Not whether to answer, but how much of the truth the answer required. I was 10, he said finally, the first time someone used my aloneness against me. His voice was level, the same register he used for everything, as though no subject warranted more or less than what it actually was. No family, no name that carried weight, no one who would come looking if I disappeared. He turned the cigarette slowly in his fingers. Men like that, men like your Ryker, they find that kind of child the way water finds a crack. They move into the space and they expand until there's no room for anything else. Skylar said nothing. She didn't move. Guang lifted his chin slightly, indicating the dragon that coiled up his neck. This was the first decision I ever made entirely for myself. The first mark I put on the world that said. He paused, and something behind his eyes shifted, just barely, just enough. I exist, and I will not be erased. The room was very quiet. Skylar looked at the tattoo, the intricate black serpent she had been cataloging as danger since the moment she saw it, and understood for the first time that it was something else entirely. It was evidence, proof of survival written permanently into skin so that no one could ever take it back. We are not the same, Guang said, as though he had followed her thought exactly. But we were shaped by the same silence. He looked at her then, directly, without performance. That silence is not what broke you. It is the most honest thing about you. The question is whether you'll let it become your foundation or your grave. Ryker did not fall apart. Falling apart required a kind of softness he had never possessed. He raged. It moved through him cleanly and completely, the way fire moves through a structure, finding every room, consuming everything that couldn't withstand it. He drove too fast. He put his fist through a wall in the apartment that now felt obscenely empty without someone in it to manage. He stood in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, staring at the space where she used to make herself small, and felt something he didn't have the vocabulary to name, because naming it would have required him to admit that his entire architecture had been built around one load-bearing wall, and she had walked out from under it. Without Skylar, Ryker was simply a man with a loud voice and no audience. He couldn't survive that, so he went looking for another way. The city's criminal underground had its own geography, basements that smelled of stale heat and old negotiations, men who dealt in the currency of information and looked at you with eyes that were already calculating what you were worth. Ryker moved through it with the desperation he would never have shown in daylight, and he began to trade. Police files, safe house coordinates, the operational patterns of every contact he had cultivated across 5 years of work, he was now burning without hesitation. He put it all on the table for a single service: breach the fortress. Bring her back. He told himself it was about possession. He told himself she was his, and the word his still meant something. But somewhere beneath that story, in a place he didn't examine, the truth was simpler and uglier. If Skylar was allowed to exist in a world that saw her, that looked at her directly and did not look away, then everything he had ever told her was a lie. And if it was a lie, then the 5 years he spent constructing it were 5 years of building nothing. He couldn't let her be seen. It had nothing to do with love. It never had. In the penthouse, the screens came alive after midnight. Guang stood at the obsidian desk, eyes moving across the data with that flat, assessing calm. And when Skylar appeared in the doorway, he didn't adjust the screens or soften what was on them. He simply looked at her and said it plainly. Ryker is coming. He has made arrangements with people who have their own interest in what I have. A pause. This building will become a target. Skylar looked at the screens, at the movement patterns, at the shape of what was being organized against the place she had, without fully deciding to begun to think of as solid ground. The fear arrived first, immediate and honest, moving through her chest like cold water. But underneath it, quieter and harder and entirely new, something else was forming. Something that had no name yet. Something that felt, distantly, like the opposite of running. It began without sound. The security monitors flooded with movement, small figures assembling at the base of the tower, spreading across the building's perimeter with the organized patience of people who had done this before. Gwang watched the screens for exactly 3 seconds before he turned from the obsidian desk and spoke 2 words to the man at his right. What followed was immediate and silent. His soldiers moved through the penthouse and disappeared into the building's infrastructure like water finding its level. No urgency, no disorder, the calm efficiency of men rehearsing something they had already memorized. Skylar stood at the edge of the room and watched it happen. She was afraid. She had decided to be afraid honestly rather than pretend otherwise, to feel it fully and let it settle underneath something harder that had been forming in her chest since the morning in the gym, since the afternoon on the sofa, since the mirror in the marble bathroom showed her a woman who was still standing. The fear was real. It just wasn't in charge anymore. Gwang paused beside her on his way through the room. He didn't offer reassurance. He looked at her with that level, unreadable gaze and said simply, "Hold your ground." Then he was gone. The penthouse went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Then the elevator hummed. The doors opened, and Ryker stepped out. He looked nothing like the man on the platform. That version of Ryker had been controlled, certain, performing confidence for an audience. This one was unraveling at every edge. His eyes were bloodshot and too wide, his shirt pulled loose, his jaw working with the restless energy of someone who had traded everything on a single outcome and needed it to land. He scanned the penthouse in fast, hungry sweeps, looking for her, already certain of what he would find, already composing the ending he had decided on. He found Skylar standing in the center of the foyer. She was not behind a door. She was not pressed against a wall. She was not clutching the red handbag. She stood with her hands open at her sides, her natural hair slightly wild around her face, her expression giving him absolutely nothing. Not fear, not defiance, not the particular flinch he had spent 5 years learning to produce on demand. Just stillness, complete and foreign and immovable. Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before. Skylar. He breathed her name like it belonged to him. She didn't move. From the shadows behind Ryker, Gwang appeared. Not in front of Skylar, but directly behind Ryker, silent as a change in weather. At every exit, figures materialized with the unhurried certainty of inevitability, sealing the room closed. Ryker turned slowly, took in the exits, turned back to Skylar. The trap had never been the building. It had been his absolute certainty that she was still the woman he made, that he could walk into any room she occupied and find her already defeated. He had walked a long way on a belief that no longer existed. Skylar moved first, not away, toward. One step, then another, crossing the foyer with a steadiness that surprised even her, until she was close enough that Ryker couldn't perform confusion about what he was seeing. She stopped there and looked at him. Not his eyes, not searching for something, just through him, the way you look through glass at whatever is on the other side. She watched him register it, watched something flicker and destabilize behind his expression. "You told me," she said, and her voice came out level, unhurried, belonging entirely to her, that a woman with no roots was a woman no one would ever search for. She held his gaze without effort. "You were right. No one searched for me." She let that land. I had to find myself. The room was absolutely silent. Gwang hadn't moved. His soldiers hadn't moved. This moment, she understood, had been left deliberately for her, cleared and held open like a space that had always been hers to fill. Ryker's face moved through several things in quick succession. Disbelief, recalculation, and then something she had never seen on him in 5 years. The specific, unguarded panic of a man whose only tool has stopped working. He had one move. He had always had one move. Locate her fear, apply pressure, watch her collapse inward. He had used it so many times it had become reflex, as automatic as breathing. His hand came up toward her arm, and stopped, fell back to his side. He couldn't do it, not because anything physical prevented him, because the woman standing in front of him had removed the architecture that made it possible. There was nothing to grip, no fear visible, no flinch available, no version of Skylar present in her eyes that remembered how to be small for him. He looked into her face and found the same quality he had run from on the platform. That absolute, unhurried absence of available fear, and the horror of it was precise and total. That look had belonged to him once. The power of it, the ability to stand inside a room and make the air rearrange itself. Now it belonged to her, completely and permanently, and without any remainder left for him. Guang's men moved in from the edges. Ryker broke, not dramatically, the way things break when they have been hollow for a long time, quickly and without much sound. He was pulled toward the elevator, and the words came then, the only ammunition he had ever actually owned, fired in a last, desperate volley. You have nobody, you are nobody, you will always be nothing. The doors closed. The words traveled across the empty foyer and dissolved before they found her. They had always been false. She had simply, finally, completely stopped being a place where they could land. The penthouse settled into a silence that felt different from all the silences that had preceded it. Not loaded, not waiting, not the held breath before something terrible. This was the silence on the other side of something survived, earned and clean and wide open. Skylar stood at the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at the city. It sprawled below her in every direction, grid upon grid of light bleeding into the wet dark, enormous and indifferent, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she had spent 5 years being told it would swallow her whole. It hadn't. It had simply been here, carrying on, holding its shape, while she was somewhere smaller, being convinced she was too insignificant to survive inside it. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The woman looking back was not the woman on the subway. The bruising was still there, still visible, still mapping the last night of her old life across her face, but the eyes were different. The hypervigilance that had lived in them for so long, it had come to feel like a personality was gone, or at least quieted, settled below the surface where it belonged. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was level. She was taking up exactly the amount of space she occupied, without apology and without the involuntary apology of the hunch, and it no longer felt like a target. It felt like a fact. The hot pink sweater was gone. She hadn't thought about it since she let it fall to the bathroom tile. The red handbag was somewhere in the suite, and she found, reaching for the familiar anxiety of its absence, that it wasn't there. She didn't need to hold on to anything right now. Her hands were open at her sides, and that was enough. Guang moved to the window and stood beside her. Not in front, not above, beside, a pillar of cold, precise stillness next to a woman who had spent the last several days locating her own temperature and finding it ran warmer and steadier than she had been permitted to know. He looked at the city the way he looked at everything, directly, without sentiment, already thinking 3 moves ahead. She looked at it differently. She was still learning what it was. She thought about what Ryker had called her deficit. No family, no roots, no name that arrived before she did and opened doors on her behalf. He had held it over her like a sentence. You are unchosen. You are unclaimed. You are nothing the world will notice when it's gone. She understood it now the way Guang had always understood his own version of it. She was unburdened, untethered from a history she hadn't written and couldn't be held hostage by. There was no architecture from her past that could be used against her because she was standing on bare ground, the only kind you get to build on entirely yourself. The ghost was gone. The rootless girl was gone. What stood at the window of the dragon's den, looking out at a city she was only just beginning to know, was a woman who had taken everything Ryker said would bury her. The silence, the aloneness, the absence of anyone coming, and laid it down, stone by stone, as the foundation of something entirely her own. If you made it to the end of this story, some part of it found you, and that part matters. Maybe you recognize the silence. The way someone can convince you that your aloneness is evidence of your worthlessness. The way you stop hearing the lie and start living inside it as though it were simply the truth about you. It isn't. Skylar didn't find her strength because someone rescued her. She found it because she stopped running long enough to stand still and discovered that the woman who had survived everything was still there, quietly waiting for permission to take up room. If you're in a situation where someone has spent days, months, or years telling you that you're nothing without them, that you're too alone, too rootless, too small to survive on your own, I want you to hear this clearly. That is not a description of who you are. That is a description of what they need you to believe so you won't leave. You are not a ghost. You are not invisible. And your aloneness, however heavy it feels right now, is not a sentence. It is ground. And ground, no matter how bare it seems, is something you can build on. You're still here. That is not nothing. That is everything. Start there. Kindly subscribe and comment. Thanks.